Have you ever wondered how your life would look if you were born into another family?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because what I am about to say is not something I ever imagined would leave my mouth, and yet here I am, years later, still piecing together how far the betrayal went. My parents always played the part of the selfless couple who put family first, who gave everything for their children, who carried themselves like examples for the community. And for the longest time, I believed it. I believed that when things were hard, when life knocked you flat, they would come through, because that is what family does. But that belief shattered the day my son's health started to collapse and the bills came in faster than I could breathe, because when I asked for help, they looked me in the eye and said there was nothing they could do. No money, no savings, nothing to spare. And I took it, because what choice did I have? They were my parents. If they said there was nothing, then there was nothing. Except I learned later that at that exact same time, transfers were being made out of their account under the label of family support, and none of that money was for me or for the child whose life I was trying desperately to save. The first hospital bill was crushing, but I thought I could manage it with payment plans, overtime, and cutting back on anything unnecessary. Then the specialists came in, and suddenly we were looking at numbers that felt impossible for someone working paycheck to paycheck. I sat at their kitchen table, papers spread out, insurance forms circled in red, and I told them straight, I cannot cover this alone. I asked for help not as a spoiled kid, but as a mother begging for her son's life. My mother's face was calm, almost rehearsed, as she explained how they had to be fair between me and my brother, and if they helped me, it would open the door to expectations. My father just nodded along. We can't set a precedent, she said, like I was asking for a luxury car instead of medicine. I walked out of that house carrying folders and a knot in my stomach, repeating her words over and over, trying to believe they actually meant they had nothing. It was easier to think they had nothing than to think they had chosen not to give it to me. 2 days later, I got a bank notification that should not have even reached me anymore. Years back, when I was helping my dad set up online statements, we linked my email for verification, and apparently some alerts were still coming through. It was a large transfer out of their account, the memo line reading, family support. I stared at it, frozen. Family support. For who? Because it sure as hell was not for me. I did not want to believe it, not right then, not with my son lying in a hospital bed. So I told myself it must have been old business, maybe something charitable, maybe a bookkeeping mistake. I buried it, because grief does that, it forces you to push down questions that might break you completely if you let them rise. Weeks stretched into months, and my son's condition only worsened. Every phone call from billing felt like another nail being hammered in. I sold whatever I could, maxed out cards I should never have touched, and signed papers that promised I would find a way somehow. When the machines finally went silent, and I walked out of that hospital without him, I carried not only the emptiness of losing him, but also the memory of my parents' flat refusal, and that one bank alert flashing like a warning light in my mind. They had something. They gave something. Just not to me, and not to him. At first, I did nothing, because grief is heavy and complicated. People told me to forgive, to let it go, to focus on healing. I tried. I smiled when I had to, I pretended that time alone would dull the edges, but inside I was burning. Burning with the knowledge that they had not been honest, that there was more to the story, and that I had let them off too easily. And the thing about silence is that it gives people permission to think they got away with it. They thought I would never ask again, never press, never peel back the layers of what they had been doing behind my back. The first step I took was small but deliberate. I hired a patient billing advocate who specialized in fighting insurance denials and hospital overcharges. I scraped together the fee because I wanted a full record of every charge, every balance, every documented request for help. Once that binder was prepared, I added one more thing, a certified letter addressed to my parents, laying out the numbers in black and white, attaching proof of what I had paid, and requesting reimbursement. Not a favor, not a gift, reimbursement. I wanted their refusal in writing, their silence recorded, because I knew this was only the beginning. I stood at the post office counter, paid for tracking, and waited for the notification. When I saw their signature confirming delivery, my hands shook. Because that signature was not just proof they received the letter. It was proof they could never again say they did not know. It started a clock I intended to let run all the way down. And as I stood there holding the green receipt card, I whispered to myself, this is only step one. Because if they thought they had buried the truth along with my son, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The thing about telling yourself to let time heal is that time does not heal anything you keep stepping on, and I kept stepping on the same rock every time I opened my email or balanced a bill, because there was always that memory of the transfer labeled family support blinking in the back of my head like a stubborn notification I could not swipe away. So when I finally decided to stop behaving like the child who waits to be picked and started behaving like the adult who demands clarity, I did. Not kick down a door, I simply followed the crumbs that had been sitting in plain sight. A school administrator who knew my brother in passing mentioned offhand that he was often seen on the far side of town near a middle school where he did pickups for a boy who shared his eyes, and while gossip is not evidence, my gut told me that beyond the whispers there had to be someone holding a stack of receipts, so I tracked down a number for a woman named Erica, and I called her with a voice that trembled the way your voice trembles when you are both angry and tired, and you refuse to let either emotion make you rude. I told her who I was, I told her that I was not there to cause a scene, and I told her what I suspected, not because I wanted to humiliate her but because if she had been promised something with the word family on it, then she, like me, deserved the dignity of truth. Erica did not hang up, which surprised me, and after a long pause that sounded like someone weighing the cost of silence against the cost of exposure, she said we could meet at a coffee shop where no one knew our faces. When she walked in, she looked like every mother I have ever stood behind in a grocery line, tired and steady at the same time, and she got right to the point, explaining that my brother had been part of her life for years. That promises had been made and broken and made again, and that when things got tight, deposits would land from an account that used a memo line almost identical to the one in my alert. Then she pulled a folder from her bag and set it between us like a shared burden, and inside were bank printouts with dates that lined up like a cruel calendar with the exact stretch when my son was in and out of intensive care. I have no anger for a woman who raises her children with whatever help she can get, so I told Erica that my issue was not with her and not even with the fact that my brother had been living two lives. Because adults make bad choices and then they have to carry them. My issue was with the people who claimed they had nothing and then found a way to fund everything except their own grandson's chance at another week. We compared dates, we circled identical phrases, and we drew a line through the week when my mother had told me about fairness and precedent, because there it was, the deposit that proved there had been something, just not for the child in the hospital bed. Erica asked me what I planned to do, and I told her the truth, that I was done pleading, done waiting, done shielding the reputation of people who used generosity as a costume, and that from now on every step I took would be documented, timed, and impossible to reframe as hysteria. There is a polite world where people pretend that church committees and community awards mean something unshakable, and there is the real world where those same committees keep ledgers that can be audited. So I went home and drafted an anonymous ethics complaint to the church circle that had repeatedly held my parents up as model donors, and I did not write a screed. I wrote a memo with attachments, redacting names to protect Erica's privacy and highlighting ledger lines that showed restricted funds being used as a private family allowance. I did not accuse them of crimes. I asked precise questions about policy, about categorization, about internal controls that existed exactly to prevent the kind of quiet favoritism that had run right over my son's life. Then I clicked send, copied myself on the submission for the record, and closed the laptop with the steady hands of someone who has finally realized that you do not have to break a window when you can switch on the lights. What happened next was small but satisfying, the way a well-placed tap can crack a veneer, because a week later an email arrived from the committee chair requesting a meeting with my parents to review donor classifications and documentation. And the tone was cautious in that way people use when they suspect they have been caught sleeping at the wheel. My phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Gloria, who has a radar for storms and always knows which way the wind is turning, asking if I had heard the talk about a review and whether there was anything she should know before the next Sunday. And I typed back a single line that made me feel more like myself than I had felt in years, which was that I had told the truth without using a single name. I hit send, stared at the screen until the dots stopped dancing, and let myself picture my parents opening that email from the committee, watching the first real consequence land with no one to blame but the choices they made and the words they hid behind. By the time the church committee sent their formal notice to my parents, I had already accepted that the only language they truly respected was money, because appearances could be managed, gossip could be redirected, and even grief could be ignored if it became inconvenient. But a freeze on funds or a formal inquiry into their accounts would strike at the one thing they had always believed placed them above everyone else. I spent long evenings at the kitchen table with papers spread out in piles that represented years of small lies adding up into one unbearable truth, and I knew that, even though I could not sue them for choosing to abandon me when my son needed them most, I could challenge the system they had built to funnel money where they wanted it while pretending they had none. I began with the certified letter I had sent earlier, attaching to it every insurance explanation of benefits, every overdue notice, and every signed denial of coverage that had been forwarded to me. What I wanted was not charity. What I wanted was proof of contradiction, and that proof was already sitting in their own bookkeeping. When I finally sat down with a legal clinic in the city, I explained everything, not with dramatic flourishes, but with cold documents stacked in chronological order. And the attorney on duty listened without interruption before saying that while I had no civil case for emotional neglect, I might have leverage in financial compliance. The transfers that were being disguised as charitable family support could, depending on how they were reported, be considered a misuse of donor funds if they had passed through accounts linked to any tax-exempt entity. And although I did not care about the tax code, I knew that the possibility of scrutiny would terrify them more than any personal confrontation. The attorney gave me a list of steps, starting with filing a request for bank review under the Fair Credit and Compliance provisions, and explained that once an institution saw repeated transfers with identical memo lines, it was obligated to examine whether the accounts were being used properly. A banker friend of mine, someone who had grown up 2 blocks away and knew exactly how people like my parents played both sides of generosity, confirmed that a compliance review could result in a temporary hold until the bank cleared the transactions. That hold, even if lifted later, would be enough to shake their confidence and make them understand that the shield they had built was not unbreakable. I spent nights preparing a summary of transactions, redacting what needed to be private and highlighting what needed to be obvious, and then I submitted it with quiet precision. It was not about dragging their name through public mud yet, it was about clipping the wire they thought would always carry current in their direction. The response came faster than I expected, a formal notice that the account was under review and that certain transfers were temporarily suspended pending verification, and while that may not sound like fireworks to anyone else, to me it was the first time in my life that I felt I had touched the one lever they actually valued. My phone rang within hours, my mother's number flashing on the screen, and when I answered, her voice was a mixture of outrage and fear. She demanded to know if I had done something, as though the entire world revolved around me finally daring to say no. I did not shout back, I did not cry. I simply said one sentence that had been rehearsed in my head since the day I signed that certified letter. When you told me you had nothing, what you meant was that you had nothing for me. I let the silence stretch, then I hung up, leaving her to stew in the reality that I was no longer afraid of her disappointment. Within days, I began to hear from relatives who never normally called me directly, cousins who wanted to know if I had really stirred something at the bank, and whether it was true that the committee had begun asking for clarification of donor funds. I answered none of those questions because it was not my job anymore to explain or defend. It was my job to keep pressing forward. The church committee followed up with my parents, and word spread that they were scheduled to meet with leadership about discrepancies. That knowledge alone was enough to create a ripple, because for years they had been untouchable, and now people were whispering in corners instead of praising them from podiums. I knew this was not the end, but just another rung on the ladder, because the plan was never about one letter or one freeze. It was about building a record so complete that when the final reveal came, No one in that family could deny what had been done. And as I tucked away the bank's notice in the binder next to the certified delivery receipt and the ethics complaint, I felt a calm that I had not felt since before the hospital machine stopped, because for the first time, my grief was not paralyzing me. It was guiding me like a compass pointing toward the truth. The revenge was not in screaming or breaking, it was in assembling every small proof until the weight of it forced the walls to crack. That night, sitting alone with a cup of cold coffee and the binder open in front of me, I told myself that if I had to keep walking alone to reach the point where the truth could not be ignored, then I would walk alone without hesitation. And in that moment, as the phone lit up again with another furious call I chose not to answer, I knew I had crossed into a place where their control could no longer touch me, because once money stops moving the way they expect, their world begins to collapse. And I had just pulled the first brick out of the wall. By the time my wedding approached, I had already decided that the ceremony was not just going to be the day I promised myself to a man I loved, but also the moment when I finally stopped carrying the shame that had been pushed on me for years. Because I was done playing the part of the daughter who smiles while swallowing poison, and if my parents wanted to sit in the front row and beam at relatives as though they had never failed me, then they were going to have to do it while staring at the reminders of everything they had done. I was not interested in a scene, I did not want yelling or chaos, and I did not want the happiest day of my new life to be ruined by theatrics, but I did want the truth to breathe in a room where it had been suffocated for too long, and I wanted every cousin, every aunt, every family friend who had swallowed the stories my parents spun to see what lay beneath. That meant planning with the same precision I had used to compile documents, because if revenge was going to be part of this day, it needed to be clean, sharp, and undeniable, the kind that leaves no room for excuses or denials. I sat down with the venue coordinator weeks before and handed her an envelope addressed to Aunt Gloria, the one person who had always been a weather vane in the family, never leading, but always sensing where the pressure was moving. And I told the coordinator that this envelope was to be handed over during the reception at a specific cue in the speeches. Inside was not a rant or an angry letter, but a summary of receipts, a plain statement in my own handwriting that explained exactly what had happened when I begged for help, what transfers were made in those same weeks, and why I could not carry the silence anymore. Alongside that, I had prepared a series of emails scheduled to send automatically during the reception, each one addressed to family members with a single attachment, the certified delivery receipt they had signed, the bank's temporary hold notice, the insurance statement with patient responsibility highlighted, and the church committee's request for clarification. I wanted every piece to land like a drumbeat that could not be ignored, delivered quietly into their hands while no one could accuse me of shouting or fabricating. When I met with my brother privately, I gave him a chance to do something himself, to finally stand up and admit the truth about the second family he had been hiding, because if he had even a shred of courage, he could have used that moment to lessen the impact. But instead he looked at me with the same nervous charm he had always used to escape consequences and said, "Not today, not at your wedding, let's just have peace for once." That was the moment I knew he would never willingly expose himself, and that the silence of the room would need to be broken not with his confession, but with my documents. I did not tell him about the emails, I did not mention the envelope, I just nodded and walked away, because I had already learned that arguing with him was like arguing with fog. It might feel like you are pushing, but in the end, nothing moves. The rehearsal dinner was where I tested my first quiet strike. Programs had already been printed with acknowledgments of family members who were meant to be honored, and traditionally my parents' names would have been listed as a gesture of gratitude. I had those names removed and replaced the empty space with one line carrying my son's name, because if they thought they could erase him from memory by pretending they had done nothing wrong, I would ensure his name stood exactly where theirs should have been. The reaction was instant and silent, which is sometimes more powerful than shouting. My mother's face went pale as she unfolded the program and read the line, and she whispered to me, "Is this necessary?" Her voice shook not with grief, but with outrage at being unmasked in such a subtle, public way. I looked her straight in the eye and answered with two words that carried every ounce of weight I had held back for years. He was That dinner continued. Food was eaten, toasts were made, but a chill had entered the air around them, because relatives who had glanced down at the program and seen the line were now exchanging looks that said more than words ever could. I felt a calm rise in me, the kind that comes when you know you are walking into the final act of a long battle, and you have already loaded every weapon you need. I did not need to scream across the table. I did not need to argue with them one more time about fairness or precedent, because the evidence was already stacked, the timing already arranged, and the silence that spread across the table was proof that they knew the next step would be even harder to escape. Later that night, as I sat with my fiancé and explained why I had made these choices, he told me he worried it might overshadow the joy of the day. I told him the truth, that the joy of this marriage would never be complete if I walked into it still carrying their lies like chains around my neck, and that I was not trying to humiliate them, I was simply refusing to carry their secret any longer. He looked at me, nodded slowly, and said he trusted me to know what I needed. That trust became the final anchor, because I was not doing this out of rage anymore. I was doing it to free myself, to let my son's memory stand visible and unashamed, and to let every person in that room choose whether to keep looking away or finally acknowledge what had been done. When I went to bed that night, knowing that the envelope was already in safe hands and the emails were set to send, I did not feel restless or afraid. I felt steady, almost calm, because the time for pleading was long gone, and the only thing left was to let the truth do what the truth always does eventually, burn through the lies until no one can pretend they did not see. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of tension that does not show on the surface, but hums underneath everything, and while people moved around the venue arranging flowers, checking sound systems, and adjusting table settings, I carried the weight of knowing that before the night ended, the story my parents had worked so hard to bury would finally be unearthed in front of every relative who had ever believed their performance. I was not nervous about the vows or the ceremony, because those were promises I wanted to make with a full heart, but I was focused on the quiet countdown I had built into the evening. A series of precise triggers that would unfold one after another until the truth stood in the room like an uninvited guest no one could ignore. I reminded myself that I had not orchestrated this out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because silence had almost killed me once, and I was not going to carry that silence into the life I was building now. The ceremony itself passed with dignity, and for a brief moment, I let myself feel the joy of standing beside someone who had chosen me not for the image I maintained, but for the scars I carried and the strength I had grown through loss. My parents sat rigid in the front row, their expressions carved into polite smiles that fooled the people in the back, but not me, because I had lived my entire life reading the difference between their public faces and their private contempt. When the reception began, the lights softened, glasses clinked, and conversations swelled into laughter, but my mind was on the precise moment when the scheduled emails would hit inboxes, when the envelope would pass into Aunt Gloria's hands, and when the silence that had protected them for years would split wide open. During the toasts, I raised my glass and began with words that seemed ordinary, thanking the people who had supported us, speaking about resilience, about family, about love that endures through difficulty, but then I paused and shifted the tone. I told everyone that some of them might have noticed a name printed in the program that they had not expected to see, and that the reason my son's name stood there was because he was the center of a story my parents had refused to let anyone hear. I said, in a steady voice that carried across the room, that when I begged for help with his hospital bills, I was told there was nothing, but in that exact week, transfers were made out of their account labeled as family support, and those transfers went somewhere else. I did not shout, I did not cry, I simply said that I could not carry the lie anymore, because carrying it had already cost me everything that mattered. At that exact moment, screens around the room began to light up as relatives received the scheduled emails. I saw faces drop, hands grip phones tighter, and whispers spread like sparks across dry grass, because there was no interpretation left, no spin or manipulation, just the raw documentation, their signatures on certified mail, the insurance statement highlighting what I owed, the bank's notice of a temporary hold, and the committee's request for an explanation. Each attachment was a nail in the coffin of denial, and every person holding their phone now carried proof that this was not my word against theirs, it was evidence against their silence. Aunt Gloria, who had been shifting uneasily since the first hint of tension, finally opened the envelope I had prepared. She cleared her throat and read aloud the simple summary I had written, her voice trembling as she recited the words. When I asked for help, they said there was nothing. That same week, the money went in my brother's other household. My son did not survive, and I have carried the weight of that truth alone until now. She closed the note with shaking hands, and when she looked up, the silence in the room was heavy and unmistakable. No one moved to defend my parents, no one rushed to explain or excuse, and for the first time, their authority collapsed under the gaze of the very people they had once controlled with charm and status. I stood there without tears, because this was not grief anymore, it was justice, and I felt the kind of release that comes when the truth finally breathes after being smothered for too long. I looked at my parents and saw them staring down at the tablecloth, refusing to lift their eyes to meet mine, and I realized that the punishment was not in anything I had said, but in the fact that no one else in that room could look at them either. Their silence had finally been turned back on them, and now they had to live in it. Then I announced one last decision, one that marked the end of the chapter entirely. I told the room that I would no longer carry their name, that I had filed paperwork to take a new one, chosen not from spite, but from alignment with the life I wanted to build, and that I had also filed a claim in small claims court to recover the funeral and medical costs that should have been covered in the first place. I thanked the people who had stood beside me when I had nothing. I thanked those who had chosen to see the truth now, and then I raised my glass to my son's memory. The music began, the dance floor opened, and I walked forward into a life that no longer carried the burden of secrets I did not create. As I stepped away, my phone buzzed with a message from Erica, the woman whose children had lived on the support I had been denied. She wrote only 5 words, "You did what I couldn't." I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, "We both did." And with that, I slipped the phone into my purse, took my husband's hand, and let myself breathe for the first time in years, because the silence was no longer mine to carry, and the truth had finally done its work.